So get ready as we invite Dheeraj Pandey for a fireside chat with Manav Garg. Dheeraj is the co-founder and CEO of DevRev. He's also the founder of Nutanix and a board member at Adobe. Dheeraj and Manav, the stage is all yours.
Good to have you here, Dheeraj.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to you and SaaS Bhumi and Avinash and Disha and everybody else.
Perfect. Of course, you don't need much introduction. Everybody knows, at least in SaaS ecosystem, Nutanix very, very well. And you have a big office in Bangalore. I know DevRev also, you have offices in India. So you're a big believer in India, of course. So I would start the conversation, since you have scaled Nutanix to, it went public and, you were darling of the street and, you built in a traditional sales-led motion. So what are the top 3 or 4 learnings in building your first venture that it'll be good for you to crystallize so that people who are building for the first time can take that and see what they can apply in their businesses today?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the first thing I'll say is that you lose a lot of hair when you build a company. So I'm trying to appear young again, with this hat, and there's a lot of real argument about whether I should keep the hat or not, but I'm keeping it because I'm learning SaaS again, for the first time, and I have to appear young and really know PLG and every other buzzword that's out there, including Web3. When you talk to really young people, they'll tell you about Web3 more than anybody else. So I think the lessons are really around culture, around customer love and employee love. I mean, the word love is not used as much in business, but we did about 7 billion in those 10 years. And we were doing $1.6 billion every year, and yet I felt like we could do so much more for customer love and for employee love and things like that. But people appreciate, business is all about human relationships. We have tried to codify a lot of the business, and at the same time, I think it's about people to people. And obviously the B2C companies have been very good at this, because when you talk about brand and B2C, it's eventually the emotional connection that Apple makes with you, that Amazon makes with you, that Tumi and Mercedes and all these really good brands make with you. And some of this is very, humble sort of brands as well. No questions asked, anything that you buy could be returned. It's a very humble sort of way of dealing with customers. And people might say that this is the end result, but it's really the input that they put into this, which is humility towards customers, that shows in the brand as well. So I think the word love is very important thing that we learned at Nutanix. We have a whole DevRev gang here. Manoj is my co-founder as well, and he and I, were overlapped for at least 7-8 years, and we go back to this one word, employee love, customer love. We talk a lot about, things like growth, but a big piece of growth is your existing customers. You cannot afford to keep buying growth from new customers all the time. So how the flywheel works, where you have enough happy existing customers and you do net dollar expansion with them, even though you lose a few of them. And then you put new customers in this, and those new become existing, and then you do expansion with them. At the end of the day, a lot of this is just about the emotion of your product and your customer service with your end users and customers. I think is really, really important. So I think we have come to put a lot of numbers behind it, but at the end of the day, business is about emotions. So that's one big lesson. I think the other big lesson is that small is the new big. In many ways, we were well known for doing very, very large deals. I mean, we took like 2 years to get $100 million from Walmart. $100 million from Walmart, just pure software over 3 years of subscription or whatever. But at some level, I think you realize that this other end of the barbell is very, very important as well, which is how do you really do this efficiently with digital and inside sales and so on. And I am just beginning to learn that, because what I did in that decade was very, very large deals, very, very large customers. I mean, out of the 7 billion, maybe 5 billion came from 300 customers.
Wow.
So you can imagine the kind of stuff that we had to do in terms of very, very large deals. But I feel like the world is going more digital. Small is the new big. And I think to learn about doing lots of transactions at scale. And there's a very important thing that's happening in our industry as well. If you go back to why software is been so popular in the last 30 years, is because a lot of atoms, which is physical world things, are becoming bits, which is, in a different universe by itself. And that's what makes software so timeless. But within the IT industry, a lot of the atoms will also need to convert to bits, which is sales and marketing, and many of these things that we have put a lot of people behind will become bits. So we're going to go from the physical world of selling and marketing and physical events and field reps and field SEs to many, many more things digitally. And I feel like that's going to be a big lesson and a learning for me this decade as well. So really looking forward to this decade as well.
So of course you were doing the first company in the Valley. So who did you turn to advise when you were stuck between two options many times? So what was your kind of framework? Obviously now we have tried to create a template in India through SaaS as well, where founders are helping each other in a very open fashion. Even if you fail, you're not afraid to talk about it. That's what we have kind of achieved in SaaS. So what has been your, what do you call, mantra, or the way when you get stuck between two or three options? Who do you go to? How did you find your way in the Valley?
So there was some really good advisors, and these advisors, I wouldn't go to them to ask what should I do, but they were great storytellers. These people just told stories about themselves, and the first thing that it did was it normalized the stressful situation that I was in, because they're like, look, I was in equally stressful situations, and let me tell you what I did. And you can figure out whether you want to use this or not. And so a lot of it comes down to normalizing the lows in a business.
Any examples so that audience can understand the best story you remember?
Yeah, Mark Leslie was a great advisor to us. Frank Slootman was a really, really good advisor to us. And go back to Mark Leslie, and you think about the first big advice, which is really, I'll tell you why it was an anti-pattern to this, because I'm sitting there in 2010. He's an early investor in the company. Mark Leslie was a founder of Veritas and CEO for the longest time. And then he retired in 2000, but he was an angel investor in a lot of companies after that. He and I were sitting along with Ravi Mhatre from Lightspeed, and Ravi had just invested in Nutanix in 2010. And we're sitting in this Starbucks and we're thinking about the strategy of the company. And we basically were arguing about our first killer app, because what we had built was a platform, and the platform by itself means nothing unless you have a killer app on it. So here I was sitting with my new investor, and here's Mark, and obviously as an advisor, you're listening to him. And he's like, yeah, don't do that app because that's dead on arrival. And this app was basically the thesis that Windows will not die, and Windows will still end up in the ether as a digital desktop and a virtual desktop, as opposed to completely vanishing because Apple and Android are here. So where is the room for a third operating system? So it was a very contrarian thing from our side to have basically said, look, we're going to stick our neck out, and we think Windows is here to stay and becomes a great killer app for our platform. And Mark is like, no, I think my son was at VMware for the longest time. We tried doing this for 3-4 years. It's not going to work, So even as an advisor, I think you're bouncing things, and it forces you to think very hard and say, okay, so what is he really saying? How do I really think about it? That whole conversation ended up in months of thinking about what's our killer app. And we ended up doing exactly that, because the whole world had come to say Windows is dead. And we were here saying, long live Windows, So I think such brainstorming sessions where you end up in this place where you're listening to yourself, more so than just listening to them, I think is very, very important. Frank Slootman, Dave Schneider, these are early on people who just helped us on go-to-market. And Frank was always, even back then, even before he wrote the book, Amp It Up, he's like, as your company grows, so does the ratio of passengers to drivers,
True.
And I think we just used it to the hilt. I don't think we were as good at Nutanix. I mean, we had grown to 7,000 people, and there was a lot of localized decision making in 50, 60 countries in terms of hiring and so on. So we had a very decentralized way of making decisions. And sales-led lets you do that because, you know, you have to be in so many countries. We had customers in 150 countries and employees in 60 countries. But then you end up realizing how many passengers you eventually end up having, you know, as opposed to drivers, you know. And I think that's a lesson that I take with me, like as we think about PLG now, and a lot of capital allocation will be centralized because you have a digital way of distributing your software. I think we'll have to be even more watchful of what does it mean to be a driver and what does it mean to be a passenger. You know?
Great insight. And how did you think about the fundraising in the Nutanix phase? Obviously, you raised from seed to all the way to IPO. So any learnings to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously we started our company right when the recession was still on, global financial crisis. And it's a double-edged sword. I mean, you know, we knew that the best companies were started during recessions simply because the fight for talent is not as frothy. So you end up getting a lot of people who are just heads down, building, as opposed to what else is out there. Am I missing something? My friends made some money, blah, blah. You get into very different frothy sort of situation, which is what's happening right now. So money was 1/10 in supply, but talent was really available, and it was good talent, really good talent. Now you see there's a lot of, 10x more supply of money, but there's also more froth in talent, and people look at a job as a transaction as opposed to, I'm here, I'm going to build something, I'm going to just put my head down. So we ended up raising, I mean, Bipul and I were great friends from Oracle, and this was his first VC job in a boutique $100 million fund that he had joined out of Oracle. And I had just quit Oracle, was working at Astrodata for 2 years before three of us decided to do this. I think we raised and diluted enough because it was again our first sort of gig, and also it was recession times. And by the second one, I think the good thing was that we didn't have to hustle a lot for trying to raise money. I think we had good pedigree and everything, but we raised the $10 million. It was expensive money. I mean, the first 13, 14 million, we'd given away half the company, you know.
Wow. The first money is the most expensive, I guess.
So the first 2-3 rounds are really, really important, you know, because you could save yourself from a lot of angst and over dilution if you just were extremely focused and kept control of your destiny in the first 2-3 years of this. Because once you actually know what you're building and you have enough feedback from your customers, all of a sudden you could dilute half of what you could have done with all this early money. You know.
I guess for the first time you're not even bothered about dilution, or you didn't even know what dilution is all about.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, looking back, you could always say I could have done this differently, would have done that differently. I mean, you know, it was, because what happens when you go to America from here, the first 10 years you spend in trying to get a green card and, you know, all this stuff, and you're not thinking, I mean, I would have started the business at 25 if I had the opportunity. I mean, you folks are very lucky to actually do this at 25. We didn't have opportunities back in India, you know, so we left for the US. We spent 10 years trying to first figure out residency, you know, food, shelter, clothing in some sense, roti, kapda, makan, and people don't have to worry about those things, you know, especially this generation here, you know. And then you end up starting a company, and then within 2 years, you know, like my federal customers, we did about $1 billion with the federal agencies in the US, you know, the course of those 10 years. Within 2 years, they're like, you got to get a citizenship, because there's no way they're going to buy from you if you're not a citizen and so on, you know. So you have to worry about a lot of these things. But then you realize, you know, this is probably the best decade of your life as well. You made so many friends. I mean, I have friends in 60 countries now, you know, and actually more because the customers are they loved our brand and the way we cared for them. So I could go to 100 countries. I did end up going to 60 countries, but I go to 100 countries, we'll have friends there as well, you know. So I think some really, really good legacy to have built.
That's the best part about sales-led motion. You make friends all over the world.
That's true.
As against the digital world where you get a lot of business but no friends. So it's always a balance. So shifting gears a bit, of course, now SaaS is kind of, you know, everywhere. And traditional investors, new investors, B2C founders, everybody's kind of jumping into SaaS. So what is your perspective in the valley from a SaaS perspective, right? How do you see this entire opportunity unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, by the way, there's a really good book that talks about this, so it's not my sort of observation, Atoms and Bits, and the third one is Genes. And this is Siddharth Mukherjee, who's written a book called The Gene. And in that, he talks about how more atoms are moving to bits and atoms will move to genes in healthcare. You know, it's like chemistry is basically atoms and small molecules, but biology is genes, you know. So I think SaaS, this whole moving away from on-prem, because on-prem required a lot of people. And when I say a lot of people, because every deployment was bespoke and the opinion of the customer mattered, and you had to have, you know, channel and global system integrators and field SEs and field reps and L1, L2, L3 support. I mean, see, there's like 7 layers of people between your code and the end user, and there's procurement right there before you even end up with the end user. So it takes you 9-12 months to get to the end user, you know. And imagine in B2C, when I have to buy anything from Amazon, there's nobody with me and Amazon, right? It's the website and me, there's nothing else in the middle. And I think SaaS is basically trying to really cut out a lot of the people in the middle, because they're probably not adding as much value as you think, you know. There's lots of atoms that could just convert to bits and nobody will actually blink, you know. And so I think there's a lot of efficiencies that will come. I mean, just the fact that you suck things out of on-prem deployment to SaaS, which is one deployment, means that there is probably 1,000 variations of your deployment that are completely gone.
Yeah.
So your support is now very different, because your support is the internal employees who are SREs and DevOps people who know about issues with performance and reliability way before your customers have, you know. So all of a sudden it creates opportunities for companies like us to think about, so what's next? And how do you really bring the developer, the maker, the product manager really close to the end user with not 7 layers of people in the middle, you know. So I think that's really good about SaaS. Now, in the Valley, people look at SaaS as Web 2. And now there's a Web 3 thing coming. So a lot of the froth, the eyeballs are like, what's about Web 3? What about the blockchain? What about decentralize everything? Because Web 2 is centralized. You know, in many ways, we took 10,000 deployments and put them in one central cloud, all of them centralized application building. And people tried to open it up with APIs and said, look, you can still hook it up with us and so on, webhooks, and there's technologies around that to really kind of open yourself up. But the Valley is thinking really hard about Web3 being the next internet, you know. And you know, it's going to take 10 years. I mean, 1994, things were pretty frothy with the internet as well. And it took 6-7 years, the bubble burst, yet the internet survived, and the companies that really stuck with it really became very, very large companies. I think it's going to happen with Web3 as well. Now, I think we are thinking really hard about where the puck is headed with Web3 and see if it can help with go-to-market and freemium models and community engagement and things like that. So I think the companies out there are really thinking hard about decentralized. And there's a lot of, I would say, hatred for centralized things right now, like Visa and MasterCard, like, okay, it's centralized, and
right.
How do you get rid of this middleman, and what does it mean to really do this on a blockchain and things like that. So I think there is a revolt emerging about centralized things as well. So we're just watching this and trying to learn a few things and see how do you really bridge the gap between Web 3 and Web 2 as well. You know.
So great news for Indian startups. They have Web 2 opportunity still open. Still the growth will happen before corporates really move to Web 3 model. I think still pretty early on the entire decentralized model. I think a lot of organization also has to be so.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, we should not think of SaaS as separate from Web 3.
Yeah.
The best SaaS companies will figure out what it means, because Web 3 is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself.
Yeah.
The idea of SaaS is B2B. And the question is, how do you make this idea of a blockchain and an idea of tokens and things like that central to a B2B transaction just as much. You know.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in Web 3 concept as of now. I think still a lot of froth as with all the new concepts, but I think it is here to stay, at least in my opinion. Now moving to DevRev, which is your current avatar. So obviously starting with big news, $50 million in seed funding. So it'll be good to decode the thinking behind it, right? When people in the room think about $1 million, now I would say $3 million. Some founders may think about 10 million seed funding, but $50 million seed funding. So what is the real thought process behind it? How do you use that capital? Why $50 million at a seed? So we'd love to get some insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, there is probably a balance between too much and too little. And there was also a tactical reason. And the tactical reason is with a thing called US Qualified Small Business Stock. It's called QSBS, where you get like all your federal taxes are basically, you don't have to pay federal taxes up to a certain, so up to a 10x of your basis or up to 10 million of your gain. So technically we raised 65, but we had, really trickling in some money. But the goal was not to raise very little and build a feature, but really build a product and build a company. I think in many ways, when I come to India, I learn a lot, but I also am asked questions. But how do you do this? How do you do this? And how do you do that? So if DevRev were to succeed, I think we'll have an opportunity to really codify a lot of those answers in software. What I mean by that is, now with PLG, and we'll talk about PLG, we should probably also do a poll from the folks here about what they think of PLG. But the idea of a PLG all of a sudden helps you codify sales, codify marketing, codify customer success into pure software that just wasn't possible because you were throwing up layers and layers of managers in the past because everything was in atoms, and now you can do it in bits. And with SaaS, it's possible because you can capture every click, which is what B2C companies are so good at. They captured every click. And they built massive machinery behind these clicks and analyzing every click and sending a marketing email and sending a text message and doing all sorts of things that was done at scale with 100 million consumers and 1 billion consumers and so on. I think it's possible to do this in B2B now because cloud makes many of these things relatively cheap as well. So I feel like there was a need to really think about building a platform. And yet we have to build 1, 2, or 3 apps on top of it. Just like, Windows would not have survived without Excel, PowerPoint, and a Word doc, So I think while we think of a PLG operating system, we had to think about 1 or 2 apps. And we felt like just building a feature was not going to really cut it.
I was trying to get a bit more, it's a very intelligent conversation I'm trying to understand. But for the audience here, so when I am starting a company, right? So how should I think about raising the seed capital? Should I raise 1 million, 5 million, 50 million? Of course, you have the persona, experience, success behind you to raise $50 million. That is one part. But if I have the option to raise, how should I go about deciding what is the right capital for me? That I was trying to come more at the perspective which is more relevant to the audience.
So I think the sort of right answer is dilution rather than dollars, because it's all relative to whether you should give up 10% of the company to mitigate risk with the cash that you get, or 50% of the company. And if you feel like you should spend a year to mitigate risk, because there's only 2 ways to mitigate risk in a company: time and money, right? You can either invest time and you get enough feedback from early users, or you say you're just going to spend money and figure out how to mitigate risk, get more people to work for you and work with you and stuff like that. And I feel like people only look at investing money and not investing time. So if they could say, if I could give myself 1 more year, maybe I don't have to dilute myself as much right now, and I take only a third of the cash being offered to me, and then I spend a year, and all of a sudden my dilution will be a whole lot less as well. And I think it's important because it's not about how much money a founder will make or early employees will make. I think it's more about, and Akanksha and I were talking about this while coming here, it's more about how you will go through the highs and lows when you want to make decisions, because any business undeniably will go through a lot of highs and a lot of lows as well. So it's less about dilution and money making, and it's more about, do I want to really have staying power to last the lows of my business, And that is the only reason to think about dilution, like, and again, it's not about power, it's not about voting rights, it's not about any of these. It just means that you're speaking with your own time and sweat equity and so on, as opposed to having to be at the mercy of too much equity or too much cash coming in. And so I think to answer your question, I think it's going to be about how much dilution do you want to take right now, and do you want to go learn from the market. And honestly, the other thing in software as well is there's reverse economies of scale. Unlike many other industries, there's reverse economies of scale. So in any young product, you can't put 20 people working on the exact same thing. You have to say, okay, 4 people, 3 people, 2 people, 4 people, if you have 5 features. So I think people have to really think of how not to overdo development in this as well. I don't know if I answered a question.
No, you did. I think I want to crystallize what you're trying to say. So time, so one of the guest learning is that time is one of the great elements which often founders ignore, especially the first term, right?
Yeah.
You don't understand the time is the biggest tool in founders' favor, actually.
Absolutely.
And that's what VCs also play on the other end, right? Because they're also trying to do everything in a smaller period of time.
Exactly.
So that actually is a far bigger tension to solve for than just the money. Because if you're successful, money is not going to matter in the end.
Exactly. You're right. Absolutely.
So I think that's a great insight to see that, how time can play a big part, is a big tool and it's a complex topic to understand, believe me. So
and it's obviously not easy, and there's no, it's not like an overdo time, because if overdid time, then the momentum also moves on, because, markets change, and, you got to also understand gut-wise, is this the right time to, grow and invest and so on. But I think it's a very, very fine balance. One of the imageries I have about a business is you're basically tightrope walking all the time, and you cannot lean in too much towards one side because you're going to fall. I mean, lean too much to that, the other side, you'll fall. So both time and money are like, two ends of the barbell that you really have to balance well.
What I have seen, I've learned is that if you're a second-time founder, if you also put some money at a seed capital, also helps you. Because seed money is the most expensive.
Absolutely.
So that can also help you balance this time versus dilution, if you have money or if your family have money.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is optionality.
Yeah.
In a safe note is an optionality rather than valuing yourself upfront. So that's the other sort of corollary to the question you asked. The answer is not just how much you raise and how much time you give yourself, but also how much optionality do you negotiate for. It's like, look, I don't know what the value is. If you're interested in me and if you like what I'm doing, then let's just do it with a safe note instead, of really doing a value round or something.
Absolutely. So moving on to, okay, you got a seed capital now. How did you go about deciding the founding team? In India, at least for the last 10 years, you select somebody from your dorm, from your college, you're very comfortable. So we saw only tech people coming together, then they figure out how to do go-to-market. Now, I think after 10 years, there's, a little bit of go-to-market and marketing challenge in India as well, so you can really choose. So what is your preferred approach, bottoms up, tops down? What do you think really matters in selecting the co-founding team?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think some of the formulas have not changed. I mean, Manoj and I go back to our dorms. We know each other for 28, 29 years now, which ages us quite a bit. But I think it's down to trust more than anything else. I mean, simple values of authenticity and the fact that you can complete each other's sentences, and the fact that you don't have to look over each other's shoulders, and the fact that you are yin and yang of each other. So it's not supplemental, it's complementary in many ways. And you cannot put words behind what complementary means. You just know that you guys are complementary.
Yes, intuitive understanding which you look for.
Yeah, it's like the complementary, and I think the most important thing is authenticity. It's like, because it's difficult enough out on the outside. I mean, the war has to be waged on the outside, but many a time if the war comes inside your home, I mean, you're basically inefficient, extremely inefficient, and now you're fighting war on two fronts. And by the way, it gets worse if you have to fight war with your spouse or partner at home as well, because that makes it even worse.
Doomsday, basically. You can't build a company.
Exactly. So the question is, can you have peace at home so that you can actually wage a war outside, and that starts with founding team, that starts with a founder, great founder that you're just authentically connected to. And even at home, I think, your significant other is a founder in many ways, and you have to have this thing because, had it not been for my wife being so and this is actually underappreciated, this whole thing about what needs to happen.
I'm going to come to that in a bit in the last section. But one question which we often get asked is, how do you split the equity among founding team? Is it equal? There's a formula. What works best in your experience?
I think it's extremely subjective, and again, you kind of know from each other as well as to what the right ratios could be and should be. I think the important thing is that both of them have to be happy after the fact. There cannot be a buyer's remorse.
So how do you talk about it? I think what I'm trying to understand the practical insights, right? Let's say you and I start the company, we get to know each other. So most of the time, founders really don't talk about it, right? And I've seen that then breaks into fight. Let's say you get a seed capital and Series A. Suddenly that equity 5% which you got less, suddenly is now, $50, $100 million, and you start feeling bad in your mind. So I think and your wife says, why didn't you take equal equity? You put equal amount of work. So that dynamic starts playing in. So how do you make that upfront? You solve that. How do you talk about it? Any practical insights?
Well, I think there's no formulas for sure. If it's haggling for the last 5%, I would say it's not worth it because 100% of 0 is 0 and 1% of 100 is 1. So when you look at that, there is value in growing the pie and not worrying about the last 2, 3, 4%. The real thing is, in the big scheme of things, how do you really think about whether it's 50-50 or whatever else? And I feel like, sometimes it's just about maybe just suppose you and I, you put $1 and I put $3. We say, okay, let's use this as a formula to do this, as opposed to anything else. And it's just about finding a simple way to say how much skin are we both putting, and we're going to put 24/7, 365, once the company is founded. But initially, you just make it simple,
Yeah, I think simplicity is the key. I think in any relationships, any simple agreements tend to last longer because there is no confusion. Any complex formulas driven off certain valuations always land into trouble.
Yeah, and by the way, you will know whether this will ever come up later as a buyer's remorse. Early on, you'll know that,
Yeah.
Those things don't last.
Yeah, it won't, of course. It won't.
And I'm speaking with experience actually. Those things don't last. So people should definitely be very careful about people who are greedy about things, or they are always about themselves and stuff. I think there's no point doing a business because look, life is hard enough already. It's really important to say, look, if I come to my office and come to work and I have to really deal with a customer escalation or losing a deal or whatever else, how do we really have peaceful discussions at home?
Oh, absolutely. So now moving on to, what DevRev does, the PLG motion. So how did you, I think, of course, we'll get to know what DevRev does in PLG. It'll be good to get an insight of how do you really, at the very onset of the base, think at a scale, right? Of course, when I was talking about 50 million seed capital, amount of money is one part, but also it's about the scale. It's about the acceleration that you think that you can get in a shorter period of time. So what was some of the design thinking behind it? It'll be good to understand that, right? Today we are talking about just reaching, 10 million and 20 million. Of course, you're talking about 100, half a billion, billion, and $10 billion. So walk us through that, the gap that we have in the ecosystem and how you think about it.
Yeah, I think, it's a good time maybe to put the Slido in front because while we are talking about this, also love for people to tell us what they think of PLG and stuff like that,
Absolutely.
I mean, many a time, and this thing comes up about, do I really hack it up until I get product market fit? And a lot of people actually do think like that, look, I don't know if my idea will ever have traction until I really try it out, and let me just hack it up and have a really good front end and, not have to worry as much about back end and scale and latency and things like that. And it might work, but I think my bias is that you have to really invest in both sides, and I mean, and I've heard this, people at Google talk about this a lot. How do you go slow early on to really go fast later, and if you think of even the first 2-3 years of product market fit, the fact that you spend some time the first year without diluting yourself too much by building a little foundation, that then when the customer feedback starts to come, you're like fast, you're changing, you're moving, as opposed to you built something and it was all kind of duct taped together, and now when the customer feedback is coming, you have to rewrite everything. So I think it's important to build some optionality into your code early on.
So give an example in DevRev, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we have to think about customizable objects. That makes ServiceNow ServiceNow. It's like customizable everything. Customizable workflows, customizable objects. It's really hard to engineer customizable anything, because you're talking about like base classes and derived classes and customers going and adding fields and objects and all this stuff. You're providing them a database to persist all this, and then you're having them write custom logic. But if you didn't embed it right now, I think when 2 years out, when you have to really make quick changes for your in your product, you will realize how slow you will be. And that's when customers walk away, like, oh, you're a feature company. You're not, and yeah, these 2 features are good, but I really needed those 2 features as well. So I think people have to understand how to build a little bit of optionality early on, and maybe have a little bit of that extensibility thinking, so that even though they slowed down by 3-4 months, they'll actually gain 2 years of advantage a year from now or something like that. Because by that time you have investors, you have revenue goals, you have growth goals. It's not the time to rewrite everything. And most people go through this. They hire VPs of engineering to rewrite everything. A magical chief product officer will arrive, and then they have to fire these people in the year, like, yeah, you just couldn't get this done right, and I expected you to actually, because I hacked it up as a founder, that's all I could do, I could hack growth. You were supposed to be the mature person in the room to have done this or done that, and it doesn't happen 80-90% of the time. I mean, the 2 roles which have a very short lifespan in a startup is chief revenue officer and a VP of engineering, for all the right reasons, right? So I feel like, there's a need to actually invest a little bit in early on, just so that you can move faster later.
It's a bit like relationships. You have to go slow to go fast later.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very important. The other thing is obviously talent. I mean, even though we've raised all this money, we think you have to be stretchy. So we're really looking at this, very, very much a startup way. Not just here in India, but in the Bay Area. I mean, imagine we had in my last job, we had 30-40 offices around the world, and all the luxuries of the trappings of what it means to be flying around the world and everything. And now we are like, okay, whatever it means, it's 2,000 square feet office space in Palo Alto now, as opposed to really try to go too big and stuff. So I think people have to be stretchy, even though they have raised a lot of money, because the more money they have in their hands, the more optionality they'll have to pivot and micro pivot and things like that. I think that these are the 2 big design principles. I think you need to have optionality in your code, so you can move faster later, and you need to have optionality with enough money that you just stretch yourself with everything. I mean, I was glad Divya asked me, because I'm going to Hyderabad for something personal. She's like, are you going to pay for this thing? I'm like, yeah, I will. You have to think like that, as opposed to, and I think this separation of church and state for founders is also very important. Many of the founder issues start to happen like, well, you're treating this like a mom and pop shop, right? As opposed to, and I'm a big investor in DevRev, but I cannot look at it as my money. It's the company's money, and that is a big Americanism, especially in the Valley. I think there's this thing that, look, this is not my money, it's the company's money. And I think India probably is going through that transition right now. In the next 5 years, I'm sure a lot of those things, separation of church and state, become really important.
Yeah, I think India is beginning to solve that problem between church and state. A lot of it came from old school thinking as well, right, which is changing now, and with a lot of governance is also coming. But I think really a good insight. I think everybody should know that how do you get the optionality both on the product, and I'm suppose also alluding on the go-to-market side as well, right? Because these are 2 sides which will continuously have to
I mean, and in go-to-market as well. I mean, again, we'll learn more what PLG really means. In fact, we have a question for that too. So once we get done with this one, we should get to that question. Because just like in most things in life, the pendulum will not swing from this side to every much so on the other side. I mean, even the companies that are doing 60, 100 million in PLG, if they have to get to $1 billion, they have to think a lot about large enterprises. And not everyone will have the luxury of Zoom and luxury of Datadog and luxury of Slack and luxury of Stripe. I think they'll all have to think about, sales-led motions in some of these enterprises, simply because the buyer is not that savvy. So they need helping hand for these buyers. Now the thing is, you still need to make sure that they can self-serve. And in large companies, there are IT people who are actually willing to tinker and so on. But very quickly, you'll need people who actually provide a helping hand. We're going to learn a lot of those things with our product as well. I feel supremely confident about our enterprise sales because I've done it. But I feel like we learn a lot and fall a lot and have to stand up a lot with this PLG side of things, because there's a lot you could do digitally, but there's also a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise in everything that you can do in PLG as well.
See, one of the things that we've seen, at least Indian ecosystem struggling, even till now to some extent, is about, okay, you decoded, so optionality is really great framework to think about. But how do you think about market opportunity? I've seen a lot of people come together, they start building whatever first idea comes to their mind. Of course, not much experience on the ground, as against, of course, you are very, very experienced. So how do you really think about few, hacks early on? If I'm sitting together and doing brainstorming with my friend or co-founder, how do you think about the market opportunity? Because that is going to limit you later on, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's no time to pivot. Pivot is very hard to get at 10 million or 20 or $100 million. So any thought around that would be really
I think
helpful.
two things, and I've learned this from so David Wadhwani, who was at Adobe till 2015, went to App Dynamics, sold it to Cisco, was at Greylock and came back to Adobe, the president. He was saying this recently, that, so what do VCs look for, especially what he was looking for at Greylock? There's obviously the team. Then the next thing he says, not the idea, it's the space. And by that I mean neighborhood. So when you buy a house, you're not looking for whatever, it's like the first thing is neighborhood, because it's schools, commute, all that stuff, and that's how real estate actually grows. The value of real estate is based on neighborhoods. Space. What space are you generally in? And the third is go to market. How efficient will your go to market be, and is this a PLG motion or not? But on the second one, I think you will be rewarded for the space, for the neighborhood you choose, just like in real estate, And then the team, if it's flexible enough to know what pivoting, micro-pivoting means in that space, probably will figure it out, And I feel that that's very true. I think you need to know your space that you're going after, and that space could be highly regulated, and that space could be full of bureaucracy and so on. So you need to know upfront, can you really pull this off in a highly regulated space? I have come to know Innovactor really well. We are big investors in Innovactor. And Abhinav is doing it from India. He did this for the first 5-7 years from India, and it's a highly regulated market, healthcare in the US as well. But knowing that in that space, what areas will actually be faster moving and quicker decision making and lower friction in go to market and things like that, I think that's the way you actually narrow it to the right street that you want to go after, because
so is there, Innovactor, I know they pivoted 4-5 times before they found out the space. Is there a way, like what you're doing at a founding stage, what insights, because that's the time when I made most mistake and it's the least costliest, right? And as you go along, more pivot, more expensive, more dilution, and employees are going to go through massive churn as well. So when I am at an ideation stage with my co-founding team, what are 2-3 things I can do, research or talk to, which will tell me an idea of a space? How do you figure out that this example of whether it's regulated or not, whether there's opportunity or not? Any hacks at the founding stage itself?
Yeah, look, obviously you get paid for your thesis. So there's no way there's going to be data coming from somewhere, a formula being applied from somewhere. You get paid for the gut. In many ways, it's like Hollywood movies, and the good thing is that unlike movies that flop, here you have a chance to pivot. You can do a few things, because once you release a movie, you're done. But I think there is an element of stubbornness, but there's also an element of being flexible. It's a paradox, You need to know that I need to be stubborn about a few things that are non-negotiable. Because the world the only thing the world knows is don't do this because nobody has, you know. As an entrepreneur, you get tested for basically your conviction. More than anything else, it's the conviction. Now, when it comes to why you're doing this company, it's your stubbornness. How and the what is where you really learn with the market. Like, okay, you know, so what are we going to do in the first 3 moves and the next 3 moves, and what can I do for the first 10 customers before I move to the next 10 customers and so on. I think that's where you have to be flexible. And this will be a day-to-day thing, you know, like, you know, we'll go through a product market fit test in the coming 6-9 months as we go through a beta. I think we'll have to be flexible on the last mile, knowing what features really matter, the fit and finish, little things of that nature that the market will tell us that, look, the only reason why I'm not doing this is this and that and so on. And then knowing who are the walkers, who are the talkers, you know, because that's where we end up wasting a lot of time with talkers, because they were good at talking. Like, I'm going to use a product, blah, blah, and now the question comes to go and ask for a check. They're like, but we don't have the budget. So some of those things actually will reduce the risk as well, but I don't think there is data or reading or whatever on the thesis itself. Because obviously you're trying to create something out of nothing. Something out of nothing. And the nothing means there's no data out there. So there needs to be enough of a gut that you have that this will actually be the thing that the world needs. If you ask the world, it said faster horses. You know, and it's actually true. I mean, I know it's cliched to say this and it only happened to Henry Ford. No, it happened to everybody. It happened to us. In our first company, the first 2 years of polls with customers was like, why would I do this? Right? But you need to have a gut that, look, there will be value in uplifting a set of people. They are the have-nots, and you bring them out of this. And as long as you have, I mean, we had a killer app in our case. You need to have a killer use case that you think the world will actually, you know, go and embrace. You know, you can go and learn from.
No, great. So this is what we all trying to figure out, the market opportunity. You saw, you know, McKinsey report also. I think these are the great tips, I think, to understand how do you match gut with some amount of data, some amount of customer info.
Yeah. I mean, look, the last 20%, which is the hardest 20%, data will come and help. You know, we were sitting with Jeff Bezos at a Khosla Ventures CEO Summit. And he said, for the longest time, people said, you are going to run Amazon aground because of Amazon Prime. Yeah. He's like, I can't tell you how much I faced internal conflicts and passive aggressive, you know, dissent about Jeff is going to kill this company because of Amazon Prime. It's like, I just had to be patient, you know. And he talked about gut a lot. He's like, look, at the end of the day, you can't replace data with gut or gut with data. You know, there's a place for gut, there's a place for data, and the initial thesis has to be based on your gut. And how you go finesse it is what data gives you.
That's great insight. I use it a lot in hiring also. I think hiring is a similar concept. You know, you really can't know a person.
Yeah. And by the way, gut is actually not bereft of data. The subjective conversations you're having is the thing that's forming this thing, which is also based on data. It just happens to be sentences and emotions and things that you cannot quantify as a spreadsheet where the value went in and then I did this math and I got this answer. I think the best founders will also like, no, I think I heard something and I heard something more, I heard something more. And when I connect this, that's my gut actually, you know.
No, great insight. I think I'm sure I continue to go on with you. I think, but let's hear.
Yeah, there's one more. So you want to put the second one now, which again it's a way of learning from the audience too. Like, what do you think about PLG? Because the word PLG is an acronym.
So let's talk about it. You know, Grish and I have been big advocates of PLG because I think it's a great India advantage. Like you said, you can do the product feature, this thing. You can reach out to the end user. You can build for the end user. You can nudge them through various things. So I think PLG is the greatest thing that is in favor of India. So let's talk about it. So
yeah. I think, you know, and this is the thesis at DevRev. You know, we feel like the last 20 years we digitized a lot of physical business processes, but we created departmental silos. You know, that's the way everybody just. So there's a lot of. I mean, I say it's physics because. You know, the first 500 million since after Big Bang was physics. There was atoms everywhere, you know. And then chemistry started to happen. And in many ways, we're going to go through this next phase where the silos of SaaS, one for this, one for that, one for marketing and sales and HR and so on, eventually has to be unified so that you are able to make better decisions. Because what's happening right now is that money is cheap. Cloud has made engineering much easier. And there's tons of people coming out with belief in themselves. So there's lots of ideas and lots of companies. There'll probably be 10x more companies. So in many ways, starting a business has become easy, but then navigating through the product market fit and keeping that business humming is become much harder because of all this noise in the market, So I think the fact that you have a feature doesn't make a company, let alone a product actually, and the fact that your product doesn't make a company either. So I feel like there will be a need to put chemistry on this, and the only way to bring multiple departments together is to unify them all on a product thinking. Like, okay, we all serve the product, which eventually serves the customer. So at the end of the day, there's a way to think about every department's goals. One of the words I recently read from one of my peers who blogged about it is there's a circuit that needs to come together across all departments that's all about the product, nothing but about the product. And now with SaaS, I think we can go and track everything. It's all about the product and the users of the product. So I feel that in essence is PLG, where you can tie everybody together through talking the product language. I mean, at DevRev, we're using DevRev for people ops, for marketing ops, for many of these things, because you need to have a product thinking. It's not just ticket thinking, it's not just service management, it's product. And then capital allocation and where you need to improve quality and things like that. I feel like product can really unify and bring the chemistry that businesses need. And if we were to succeed, I think we are starting with what does it mean for developers to think about product as opposed to thinking about dev tools, like what are the prod tools that people need to build? Because now you're one step closer to the customer when you think of prod. How do you democratize the data around product analytics, user analytics to all the developers? How do you make the have-nots feel like they're business people? They're not just coders who you give them a cube and a laptop and they go and code, but instead you elevate them to being makers and have them have a seat at the table where they can ask questions about, so where is the product market fit? Why are we treating customers and why are we treating employees and stuff like that? I think all that can happen if you can democratize a lot of this product thinking and the customer that uses the product to everybody in the company actually.
So how do you, I think one of the greatest topic which we've been debating is how you design your org structure, because your silos are going to go away, right? Even take a classic sales, marketing and product, they are not any more departmentalized, right? So how do you design, how does the org structure change, especially in the early days?
I think it starts with systems, because if you still have 10 different systems, you cannot do an org structure around it. And you have young people who basically are like, I don't know another way of doing it. Because when you, and this is not to be ageist or anything, but there are people who are experienced but are also very good at learning new things, and they're great addition. But I think when you end up overdoing experienced people who are set in their way of doing things, you will never learn something new.
Correct.
Right? I think the best thing was first 6 years of Amazon. It was first principles thinking. They didn't know what internet was and how do you distribute books on the internet. But then they got a bunch of people from Walmart to come and work there, But they were people who were willing to evolve with the internet. They're like, look, okay, if internet is the way and it's the opposite of brick and mortar that Amazon, that Walmart had, we'll learn those things actually. I think people who are willing to evolve and learn and say, look, I don't know much, are the best way to actually say, do you have an executive team that is going to evolve as fast as the market will, because the market is going to evolve really, really fast. And you better have people on the inside who are pulling the company rather than the company pushing them to say, why don't you learn this? Because the market's going at this pace and so on.
So what kind of systems and tools you have adopted in DevRev from the start?
We're biased, we're using DevRev for a lot of things internally. But we also know the things that we buy are the things that will not compete with. We're going to integrate the heck out of it. And by integrate, I don't just mean a checkbox, but like really deep like peanut butter jelly, like, dosa and sambar kind of stuff,
What is the outcome you're solving for in the system? Let me ask the question other way around. So when you're thinking of a system at a startup stage, what are the 2, 3 outcomes you're solving for?
Well, initially it's the product. You have to understand quality. You have to understand, what does it mean to really get things done fast. CI/CD like things, like, there are things that you need to do which really deploy the product faster. And the fact that you can be right there for the early customer who's willing to give time, because they're investing time in you in real time. How do you really focus in conversing with them, but also bring everybody. I mean, I heard this from Hemant today, and I really loved it. He said, look, systems of record built in the last 20 years was kind of the first step of digitization. Now people are saying, can we get a system of engagement to pull in all the records in it and then bring intelligence to it? Because we're really trying to humanize IT now. Like, okay, it has to be engaging first, then memorizing. Like, okay, I have all these records and I can spit out spreadsheets and lists and all sorts of things. But also it's intelligent and smart. So when we look at even the dev tools the last 20 years, like, Atlassian, for example, Jira was built 20 years ago as a system of record.
Yeah.
To do engagement, you go to Slack, and to talk to customers, you go to Intercom, and to deal with your end users, you go to like 10 other tools. So I think our opportunity here is to really think of a new way of doing business with product at the center that unifies departments, and yet start with the crawl stage. The crawl stage is, what's the next generation of Jira going to look like? Can it look like Slack? And can it have a lot of things in the front line where customers want to talk to you all in real time? Because when I'm 10 people, I don't have support people. I have to do this on my own. The product manager has to be there. The dev has to be there. Maybe as they grow, the support person actually ends up owning those things. But then it's all happening in real time. I'm not starting all this in Slack and all this in Jira and all this in Zendesk and all this somewhere else. That's basic thinking that we actually have here.
I'm sure things are going to change drastically. I can continue to talk to you for hours. So I'm going to go to the last segment, which is more on the personal side. I think one of the my favorite topics, and also with entrepreneurs also, this is mindfulness. So you have seen the journey of, as they say, your lifetime. Once you're an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur, whether you turn to be investor or not, but your mindset will always be a founder. So what are a few stress points you have gone through in your life, and how did you go about handling those stress points?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is good entrepreneurs never complain. Just about life, about anything. I think you have to have fun for as long as you're doing it. And however bad the situation is, I mean, many a time you also absorb. There's one of my favorite words in life is a Japanese word. It means gaman. It says G-A-M-N, gaman. And gaman in English means stoic endurance. Like, you have to endure stoically, because the more you bitch and moan and complain about things, the more you're creating this sort of blast radius of people who are like, oh man, how do I deal with their emotions and, like, highs and lows of everything. So endure, and how do you endure? I think I look at trifectas to just figure out how to endure. You've got to breathe better. So doing not just yoga in the last 2 years, but also last 10 years of learning to breathe. Even in a meeting, you will get impulsive. You want to actually say how crappy an idea is, and you didn't realize you actually start to attack the person rather than the idea. So you got to breathe. You take a deep breath and like, okay, I need to change the way I word myself, because otherwise they'll think like I'm attacking the person rather than attacking the idea. Because you'll have to attack ideas. Otherwise you are sitting in a, very happy-go-lucky environment where people think things don't change. So breathe, sleep, really important. Sleep well. I mean, I cannot compromise on sleep. Although when I traveled, I used to, but then I would come on the weekends and sleep a lot. And smile, I think, you don't realize how much of a disarmer smiling is, and the most difficult of discussions. We used to sit in discussions where we had to get a $10 million check. And imagine getting 100 million from Walmart is really, really hard. But the more you smile, the more people are like, you know what, this is the right person I'm really dealing with. And the right business is about people more so than software and tools and stuff. So breathe well, sleep well, and anytime you go through the lows, you got to sleep it out. I mean, one thing that I have really done well in the last 15 years of my life, I've never written an email or a Slack message that I've had to edit or recall.
Did you have to?
Edit or
Edit it,
recall.
okay.
So it's really important. If you have to write an email, you sleep over it, write it tomorrow, you'll actually do it better, And those are the kind of things that the people around you are looking for. Like, how often are they recalling an email and having to say, because look, there's enough opportunities out there for people to really go and do things, So, and I was using this analogy, when you get into turbulence, the passengers look at the crew.
Right.
And if the crew is panicking, they're like, okay, I don't think we'll survive this, So it's really important for the crew to be extremely poised and, breathe well so that the rest of the passengers don't have to panic,
Okay, sleep, I think I also find sleep as the biggest stress buster for me as well. I think it just sleep over, all the conflict goes away. I think so you leave whatever you left behind that night and then you start the day every day fresh. I think, so how do you take family along with you? Of course, entrepreneurs have a very hard life, right? Whosoever is entrepreneur, founder here, you're signing up for a hard life in front of you. And a lot of them, I'm sure, are not married as yet. So how do you take your family, your parents, a lot of us are coming from middle class backgrounds, especially in India, right? And so how do you take your family along? And I've seen, sometime even, founders who are building multi-billion-dollar companies, their parents don't even understand what they're building, right? And probably the value is coming now because there's more media. So how do you take your family along? What are the few tips? Because as you said, they are also a co-founder in this journey, right? They have to have a peace at home to build a large business or build a business of meaning.
Well, so we got married in 2000. When I was 25, we got married. And we postponed having children for 10 years till 2010. But I felt like without my wife, I probably wouldn't have taken all the risks. I mean, she was so with me on these things. And, when we started Nutanix, all I had was $100,000. And that too in a 401k because we had spent whatever we had on buying a home in India and a couple of other things. But I think you're taking a big bet. And I mean, your significant other has to realize that the worst is not bad enough. I mean, because entrepreneurs are not irrational people. They just have a worst case thinking, which is highly rational. They're like, look, worst case, I'll go and do a job. What's the big deal? I think I spent 2 years and I figured that I was not cut out for it, go back to a job. So your significant others have to really also relate to your worst case. And they'll sleep well, and they will not have the impatience of why you're doing this and stuff like that, So that's very important. In 2009, I asked my cousin, who had also built a very large business in his life, a comparison shopping engine in the US and sold it for $1.3 billion back then. And I'm like, what should I do? He's like, look, I postponed my life. He never got married either, And he's like, you won't realize that you will actually, if you have children and you are a father, you'll be a better entrepreneur. And I still resonate with him. He's like, look, you'll be more patient. You'll know what it means to roll up your sleeves. You'll know how not to get angry. All these things will help you become a better entrepreneur as well. And I used to think that, it's a finite game. If you do this, you can do that. But life had a way of really panning itself out. We had our first child in 2010 when our company was barely a year old. We had twin girls in 2014. And imagine like 3 kids and we're still building a business. Life has a way of working itself out, And I feel like it's the best decision I would have made because, there's also this thing about when you travel and you go back, the joys of meeting them again and all that. So I would recommend everybody to get married, have children, and go build a business along with it as well.
So how do you really solve the time conundrum? See, the least we talk about time in terms of how do you negotiate through investors and employees, but also in a personal life, I think you also trying to figure out the time, right? You're not at home in time, you're not there for a movie, you're not for your first birthday, first anniversary, and so many missed family, those precious moments, right?
Yeah.
So how do you negotiate to that? Any mantras on the time management? I think that would really help everybody.
Well, the first thing is, so I learned a lot from Vinod on this. So in any Coastless Summit, he would bring Neeru along,
Sorry?
Neeru, his wife, along. And his business was not divergent with hers, So she wanted to do philanthropy and many other things. She would come and stay with us in Cavallo Point, where we actually have 3 days of offsite. And I felt that even the way he dealt with his children, you know, he's 4 children, we know that 4 children. And he talks about this, that, so in 1986, he comes out of Sun Microsystems. For 4 years, he leaves Nehru in Delhi. And he's a young guy at Kleiner Perkins. He's flying every month back to India, once a month, between 86 and 90, till 92 actually. And he's like, okay, it's that important that I don't leave her alone and the kids and all this stuff. So to weave them into your work so that it's not 2 separate things is also important. Like, I started talk to my our son about some of these things as well. Like, you know, I'm learning crypto a little bit from him. He's building NFTs and things like that. And even though it's not exactly my business, I'm learning a little bit about some of these things from him as well. He's learning the word arbitrage. He's like, so he's now a sneakerhead. He's like, oh, I'm going to buy sneakers, I'm going to sell sneakers, I'm going to make some money, and I'll show you that I can make some money as well. I think those are the ways in which you have a relevant discussion. I think quality over quantity. For many people, so I'm very mindful not to look at my phone or my laptop when I'm in a meeting. I'm like, it doesn't matter, I think these things can stay. The same thing at home. When I'm talking to them, I'm not doing this. I just feel disrespectful, you know, to them as well. And when I'm doing this, I'm not looking at them, you know. So there is a certain element of focus and mindfulness that comes here as well. I think it's quality over quantity more than anything else. Yeah.
Oh, great, perfect. So at that note, I think I will end the conversation. It was
Thank
great
you.
talking to you, great insights from business to personal life. Thank you very much being candid and openly sharing.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating, and look forward to learning more from you folks. In the,
Any questions for Dheeraj, please?
Every SaaS company wants to achieve product-led growth. But my question is it possible to achieve that from day one? Or we have to start with the sales growth, sales-led growth, and then understand the process, the touch points, and then try to automate the touch points? Like,
Yeah.
what's your journey? How? Because you dealt with both of them. Right, yeah.
well, a lot depends on your economics, you know, the way you priced it, the way we've engineered it as well. Like, you know, we just recently bought a product, a SaaS product that we bought for enterprise search. They cannot have a freemium model because of the way they architected it. Per tenant, cloud costs will basically define pricing, will define how much you need to get in ASP, will define whether you need to insert a human in the middle or not, you know. So this is all back to the big bang of your product and how you architected the product. Is it a B2C-like architecture where you can have 10 million active sessions? Or it's the old B2B style where you can have no more than 5,000 active sessions, you know. And if it's 5,000 active sessions, then each of the tenants will take maybe $500 every month of cloud costs or more, and it adds up to $10,000 a year, and therefore you need to extract $40,000, therefore you need to have a salesperson. This is all starting from that little thing that you did early on to say, okay, how many concurrent users can I have, and can I absorb the cost of individual sessions or not, if that makes sense, right? So this is horses for courses. You'll know based on your own product whether you can survive early on 1 million sessions or not. I mean, think about it. I mean, GitHub had 50 million users, but they sold for like $7-8 billion, which was not deserving of 50 million users. They could have been a $100 billion company actually at 50 million users. Two things: they probably couldn't figure out ways to monetize, and secondly, they couldn't keep 50 million users active at the same time because the multi-tenancy model was probably not as scalable as it should have been or something. So everything depends on your ASP. If you have to extract $100,000, you will need to insert a human. If you can live with extracting $10 and $20 and $50 and $100 and $1,000, and the word of mouth to travel like that, I think you can do it like pure PLG, just like Netflix, just like Amazon, just like any of the B2C companies as well. You know. Eventually though, just like Zoom and Stripe and Datadog, you will insert a human, And the question is whether it's an inside salesperson or a field salesperson, I think if you've gotten to a point and it's a rich man's problem, if you've gotten to a point where you're already doing $1 million and now you need to take this to 10 million, you'll need a field rep. Because now the customer is also saying, you have too many cost centers, too many credit cards in my organization. I need a single enterprise license agreement. I am procurement. I don't make decisions on the product, but I do make decisions on how I need to discount it and how I need to standardize it and how I need to have a single ELA for it. That's when procurement comes in.
100 million is stuck in my head. Can you explain how you converted such a big contract or deal? Because it's a dream for any company to even have that range, right? So 100 million is mind-boggling. Can you explain how you went about it?
Yeah, and by the way, when I look at Adobe's numbers, that number looks small. When I sit there in Adobe's business, I'm like, wow, you can do 100 million, many $100 million deals like that, But I think it starts with 400K. It starts with the next million and the next 3 million. So I think the one thing that we did well in our last company is don't go for the first 100 million right away, because that's whale hunting. And you'll never build trust for anybody to do 100 million with you right away. It has to start with 300-400K, then to the next million, next 3 million. Now 3 to 10 and 10 to 30 is actually easy. The first 300K, the next million is the hardest part actually. That's why you need to break it down to like milestones, like how can I get only 100K from Walmart, And then the word of mouth, then a few more users and more education. And now I have addressable users and they're finding delight in the way they use this thing. And then of course you need to have a great sales rep to go and really make this bigger than what you think it is,
I think winning the trust is a key thing in an enterprise.
Winning the trust. Anything. Even
Yeah.
B2C actually. And I said, the reason why I trust Amazon as a retailer, no questions asked, return everything. These days, sometimes when I have to return something, they're like, oh, you've bought so much, it's $200. Even the fact that you've thrown the box, just keep it. We'll just give the money back to you. That's trust.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think that trust has to come a little 100K at a time, and you'll slowly realize that it becomes exponential like this. You don't have to win linear trust. It's not like every million came every month or something, It starts to go like this over time.
Just want to ask you on the gut part of it, which you said it's not against data. And it's some kind of a disparage data points, right? Can you just build a little bit on that?
I think the word data, because many people use data to outsource decision making. But they don't realize that data has biases too. I can look at data biases, there's like 20 data biases out there, but they use data to argue for something. I think data is something that complements your gut, but the nothing to something, there's no data for it. That's something that you have to visualize in your head and connect the dots. And again, I don't mean to say that you're not collecting information. Subjectively, you're collecting information, and you need to have a thesis that's based on years of your watching stuff and observing stuff and so on. That's what you get paid for. Because if everybody had to build a company based on data, then everybody would build a company, right? There's a lot of art in building a business, just like there is in music and making a movie or anything else that's very artistic,
I guess gut gives you direction and data kinds of confirm it
Exactly,
many times.
you're right. Just well said, it gives you a general sense of direction and data will help you do this.
Yeah, confirm it.
Hi, this is Sudhir. I would like to understand how did you acquire your first 5 customers? And,
First 5 was a lot of hustle, a lot of begging, and a lot of, because amongst the 50 conversations, 45 will say, I think you're building the wrong thing. And only 5 will actually say, I'm willing to give it a try. not because of anything but the fact that they will look like heroes. You need to make them into a hero in their organization, you know. And the fact that they are the folks who are the rebels, who want to fly under the radar. They want to break glass, you know. They don't do things in ways that have been accepted as the norm. They want to be the exception. Just like you are a rebel, your buyer is also a rebel. The early buyer is a rebel, you know. So you need to identify the rebels, you know. The fact that the fire that you have in your belly really joins the fire in their belly and becomes a bigger fire, actually.
Got it. One final thing in terms of what do you think about community-led growth? We are talking about product-led growth, but of late, right, a lot of companies are moving towards company-led growth.
Company-led growth, obviously it's tied to the unifying thing, which is product.
Community-led growth. Community-led growth.
Community. Community is users, and users use your product or help others with the product. They're actually tied together very much so. Look, B2C companies, they all had community-led growth as well. The reason why I buy from Amazon without asking questions is because the reviews are awesome. Like a 4.8, 20,000 reviews, that's it. I'm not even looking at anything, you know. That was community-led growth. I think at some level that has to be part of your overall product thinking, you know.
Thank you.
Right?
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Dheeraj. It was a great.
Thank you so much, Manav, for everything.